Welcome, everybody. Appreciate you coming all the way over to the TCC. It always feels like you're walking out in the middle of nowhere when you come over here. It's my second time to present, I think in this same room, but I appreciate you making the walk. So by show of hands, who all is a first-time PASS attendee? You've never been here before. Wow. Well, thanks for coming, first of all. Fantastic to see all of the the first-timers. Several of my clients in the room, so thanks for chasing me all the way out to Seattle to get a little more time with me. We're going to talk about integration services and Azure Data Factory, and specifically how the two stack up. So these two tools work in essentially the same space. They do ETL or ELT in some cases and move data, transform data from one source to another, one source to a destination, sometimes multiple destinations. There has been some confusion about which one is better, which one should I use. So I want to compare those two and talk about the features of each one and give you a good idea of which one might be good for any given scenario. Just by show of hands, who has never seen integration services before? Handful of you. Who's never seen Azure Data Factory before? And who's never seen either one of them? A couple of you? Okay, fantastic. Even if you've never seen either tool, you're in the right place. So we're not going to go too deeply into the weeds on all the moving parts. I want to give you a high-level overview of what each tool can do, what the strengths are for each, what the deficiencies are for each, and so on. As usual, please silence your cell phones. Especially for those who are new, PASS isn't just what you see here today or this week. There's a lot of opportunities for virtual chapters, for in-person meetings, and things like that. We definitely encourage you, if you're a new person to PASS and you don't know what all PASS does, definitely check out some of the things that they do, both in your local community as well as some of the online groups. I can tell you that I've blogged about some of the ways that being part of the community has helped me, so I certainly encourage you to get in and do something, whether it's volunteering or just getting to know your peers in that area. So a little bit about me. I know quite a few of you. Several of you I don't know. My name is Tim Mitchell. I'm a BI consultant. I'm a Microsoft Data Platform MVP for the last almost 10 years. I run a company called Tylerus Data Solutions out of the Dallas area. We specialize in data warehousing, ETL, data architecture, and reporting and analytics. I co-wrote a book called SQL Server Integration Services Design Patterns, and I am a huge fan of the Oxford comma. If you want to follow me on LinkedIn, Tim Mitchell at LinkedIn, and Twitter, Tim_Mitchell. My blog is timmitchell.net. You'll find all the resources from today out on my blog, as well as a lot of things that I've blogged about over the years. For your evaluations, I would definitely appreciate your evaluations, whether your feedback is good or constructive. I certainly appreciate all the tips that you can give me, so please do that. And for today, what our overview or what our agenda will be is, first we'll talk about an overview of both integration services and Azure Data Factory. Since there were a number of people who had never seen either one or both of those tools, I want to make sure that everybody's up to speed on what each one can do and the high-level capabilities of each one. We're going to talk about some head-to-head items, and specifically I've grouped my head-to-heads into 3 different categories. I'm going to talk about functionality, what each one of those tools can do. We're going to talk about performance and some of the caveats and some of the strengths and weaknesses in terms of performance in both ADF and integration services. We'll talk about manageability, which is often the overlooked piece of this. Even if the tool performs well and it's got a lot of functions, if it costs you a lot of time to have to maintain it, push the source code through, and things like that, you want to make sure that you're aware of those shortcomings before you choose one or the other of the tools. We've got a few other factors that I'll go through as well that don't necessarily fit into either of those categories, and then I'll give you my final verdict. I'm going to give you a huge spoiler right now. I'm not going to tell you which tool you should be using out of SSIS or SSIS or ADF. Both tools have some great strengths. Both of them have some shortcomings and things that I wish they did better. But ultimately, you'll have to decide on each job that you have or each project that you have which tool is right for the job. Hopefully, I give you enough information that you can make that decision in an informed way. So just to give you some perspective, everybody brings biases to the table, especially when you're doing a presentation. I want to give you my perspective, so if any of my biases come through, that you know where that's coming from. For a long time, I've been an integration services guy. That's my go-to tool for ETL. I've used Azure Data Factory just because it is the new and up-and-coming tool, and a lot of my clients are at least leaning toward getting into that. But most of my experience, and frankly, most of my successes have been built around integration services. So if you hear a little bit of a bias toward integration services, that's probably, you're probably interpreting that correctly. If there's something that I think is subjective, and I think I'm putting my bias into that, I'll let you know. I can tell you that I'm a huge fan of the Microsoft SQL Server stack and the Microsoft Data Platform stack in general. So you're not going to hear me say stay away from Azure Data Factory or stay away from integration services. But I do want you to be aware of the biases, especially when we're talking about a feature-by-feature comparison on some of those things. So high-level overview of integration services. For those who indicated that you hadn't seen integration services before, this has been around since 2005. It was released with SQL Server 2005. How many of you had the pleasure of working with DTS before integration services? All right, so a lot of you have grown up with integration services like I have. DTS was a fine tool. It's definitely a dated tool now. When they released SSIS in 2005, it took away a lot of the pain points that you had in DTS, not quite all of them, but it took away some of those pain points that you had in administering DTS. It really is a simple tool to learn, and if you've never seen it before, it's one of those things that you're not going to master in a matter of hours or probably even days. But I tell folks, and I do a lot of training as well as consulting, I tell folks if I could spend a half an hour or an hour with just about anybody who has data platform experience, I can get them to a place in an hour where they're using SSIS to build fairly simple SSIS packages. Doesn't necessarily mean they're an expert, but it is a fairly easy to use tool. And that's one of the strong advantages that I see in integration services, apart from not just ADF, but some of the other tools in the marketplace as well. It was principally designed as an on-prem solution. So the reason I mentioned the history of DTS is that even though it was released in 2005, a lot of the concepts that are built into that were designed even before 2005. So much of the behaviors that are baked into integration services predate the cloud as we know it. So connecting to Hadoop, connecting to any form of Azure, those are largely concepts that were added on to integration services after the fact and didn't come baked into it originally. It has evolved where you've got some baked-in pieces and some either add-ons from Microsoft or add-ons from third parties that have expanded that into the Azure offerings and the cloud offerings in general. But do keep in mind that it was originally just an on-prem, for the most part, an on-prem data transformation tool. Deploying it, you had a couple of options for the early versions, either MSDB or directly to the file system. Those were the only options in 2005 and 8. It made it easy for deployment because you deployed a single package at a time. Logging was a bit of a challenge because you had to do logging on a package-by-package basis, which was a real pain. Starting in 2012, we saw the SSIS Catalog come out. So the SSIS Catalog was a brand new way to store, execute, and log your SSIS packages. When the catalog came out, it largely replaced what was being done in MSDB, or the file system deployment. You no longer had to write code to get things like error or warning information or warning logs into a table. It would do that automatically for you. Same thing with row counts. A lot of us wrote custom code to gather row count information that came baked into the SSIS catalog if you used the right logging level. And this was really portable in that you could deploy to the catalog and then run from either T-SQL or DT-exec. So if you wanted to embed that in a T-SQL script, it was really simple to do. So to recap on integration services, a few of the strengths that we see there. There are no extra licensing costs if you already own SQL Server. A lot of people say SSIS is free. It's not really free. It comes with the SQL Server engine when you buy SQL Server. So if you need to use integration services, you're already using the database engine, it doesn't cost you anything extra as far as the licensing goes. Even more importantly, there are no extra licensing costs if you're using for your execution or data storage. So if you're, once we get to talking about ADF and really a lot of the other service-based tools, you're going to pay for, in some cases, every execution or a block of time that you're running an execution. If you're running integration services either on-prem or in an Azure VM, it doesn't cost you anything at all to run that execution over and over again. It might cost you something for storage if you're running a VM and you're storing that information on a disk. But as far as SSIS, it doesn't care what you're storing from that perspective. Integration with third-party tools. A lot of you are using some third-party tools that will easily plug into integration services and do some of the things that SSIS either doesn't do or doesn't do well. Those are really simple integrations. You install the tools on the server, you install it on the workstation where you're developing your solution, and you're good to go. And finally, you've got really granular control if you have a performance issue, if your disk I/O is high, if you're running out of memory, maybe if your CPU is spiking, you can target just that one item and upgrade your VM or your physical machine and address that specific performance issue. So some of the downsides that we see in integration services, one of the big ones is it does require, in almost every case, for SQL Server to be installed, which means that even though it comes along with a SQL Server license, you do have to have SQL Server installed somewhere to make that work properly. Along with that, you have to have a machine that it's running on. It might be an existing SQL Server. It might be a standalone machine. Anybody running SSIS in a standalone machine? I don't see that done very often. I do see a few cases of that. In that case, you're paying for 2 licenses, and you have multiple machines that you're having to configure as well. Scale up and scale down is a challenge with integration services, because scaling up or scaling down means best case scenario, you're resizing your VM. Worst case scenario, you're resizing your hardware, which is expensive both in the cost of the hardware as well as the downtime that it takes to take it down, upgrade the hardware, and bring it back up. So it doesn't scale up and down very well. And lastly, it's software. It's on-prem software. So you do have to update it. You have to update your operating system. You have to update SQL Server itself. You have to update if you're using third-party plugins. Those require updates as well. So again, none of these are deal breakers for integration services using it on-prem, but these are some of the challenges that, for those of you who have used integration services, you've probably run into these things before. So let's talk a little bit about Azure Data Factory. I'll take this a little bit slower since most of you indicated that you hadn't seen ADF before. This relies on mostly a serverless architecture. What that means is that there's not a server that you have to configure. There's not a VM that's exposed to you where you run these packages. It's purely a service-based architecture. It is fairly new. It's come around in the last maybe 4 or 5 years or so, so it's not quite as mature as integration services. But it does have a lot of the new features that you won't see in integration services quite yet. For those of you who have used Azure Data Factory, who all started on version 1 before the current version? So I can tell that for the ones who did raise their hands, I can tell you probably have some battle scars. I started with version 1 as well. I did several presentations on that. Version 1 was clunky. It took a lot. You had to practically know how to handwrite JSON to make it really do what you needed to do. Version 2 eases that. I won't tell you that you'll never handwrite code again. In fact, you almost certainly will handwrite code, but you're going to do it a lot less in version 2 than you did in version 1. And for those who want to know, you can still go back and write code in version 1. I don't recommend that you do that. It's an exercise in futility. It was built with the way that we process data in the cloud in mind. It doesn't do as good a job with on-prem data as integration services will do. But if you're dealing with just cloud-based architectures, pulling data from cloud to cloud, doing some sort of intermediate data store, this is where ADF really excels, because it's a cloud-based tool designed mostly for cloud-based sources and destinations. It does do some on-prem integration as well. It takes a little more complexity to get your on-prem data, and I'm sure you can understand that going from the cloud, reaching back into on-prem, and then going back to the cloud, if that's the route that you're taking, does require some additional complexity. It can be done, but it's a more complex solution when you do that with ADF. Here's one of the really nice things about using Azure Data Factory. Really, there's 2 different Azure Data Factory components that we have to talk about. ADF proper, which is where we go through and create an Azure Data Factory. We create our copy operations. We create our data flow operations. You heard about the data flows in the keynote earlier this morning. Those were just released in general availability, I think, a week and a half or 2 weeks ago. So that's a proper ADF, where you're creating your sources and destinations directly in Azure Data Factory. That's the traditional way to do it in ADF. Another way to manage your ETL infrastructure in ADF is to take your existing SSIS packages and do what's called a lift and shift. Take them from where they are, deploy them up to an Azure Data Factory Integration Services runtime environment, and run your SSIS packages directly in ADF without the need for a virtual machine. This is a really interesting use case for ADF because it requires almost no additional investment for you to be able to take those existing packages. If you're using just the native behaviors in SSIS, just the built-in components, most of your packages are going to work if you take them from on-prem and move them up to the cloud. Again, assuming that you're not reaching back or doing anything complex with going from cloud to on-prem back to cloud. If you're just connecting to cloud-based data sources, those will likely continue to work with minimal or maybe no modifications when you push those up to the cloud. If you're on the fence, if your organization is looking to go to the cloud, I've got a client that I'm working with right now on this. They have a mandate to go to the cloud, but they don't have any in-house ADF experience. So they're looking at doing this as maybe it's a stopgap, maybe it's a permanent solution, but taking those existing SSIS packages, getting them off their on-prem servers, which they're eventually going to get rid of, and pushing those up to the cloud. So you would still manage, when you do it like this, you would still manage the SSIS packages exactly the same way you always have. You build them in Visual Studio and SSDT. You deploy them up to an SSIS catalog, except that the catalog that you're deploying them to is simply an integration services runtime rather than a physical or a virtual machine that you control. So some of the strengths around ADF, you don't have to have SQL Server installed. For those of you who are not dealing a lot, I know most of you probably deal with SQL Server in some form, but there are some architectures where SQL Server is not a major player. Maybe you're using Postgres, maybe you're using, heaven forbid, Access or something like that. Whatever tool you're using, if you're not using SQL Server as a major part of it, there's no reason that you need to run SQL Server simply to have integration services. You can run it purely in ADF and not have a SQL Server at all. You can very quickly configure an Azure Data Factory. If we get time, I'm going to walk you through all the way from zero to creating a basic data factory in here to show you how easy it can be. The latest version, as I mentioned earlier, does have a much easier learning curve than earlier versions. And once we get to the demos, you'll see that there's a lot of attributes in Azure Data Factory v2 that look very much like integration services. So if you're already used to integration services, connections, data sources, data destinations, transformations, you're going to feel fairly comfortable in a short amount of time whenever you move over to using Azure Data Factory. It does exist as integrate, as I mentioned earlier, with your existing SSIS packages if you choose to go that route. And if you need more horsepower or less horsepower to run your ETL from time to time, this will easily scale up or scale down with just a few clicks through the UI. For those of you who have some sort of seasonality in your data, if you work for an accounting shop, if you work for a retailer, you're going to have spikes throughout the month or throughout the year where you need a lot more processing power, and then you don't need quite as much for the rest of the time. You can easily scale up or scale down using Azure Data Factory, either the proper Azure Data Factory using sources and destinations, or using the integration runtime and running your SSIS packages. Both of those will scale up and scale down in minutes. So some of the challenges, the one that I put at the top of the list is the one I hear the most complaints about. There are a lot of different ways that you can spend money in Azure, and specifically there's a lot of ways you can spend money in Azure Data Factory. If you're spinning up an integration runtime, you can spend money on that. If you're storing data, you're either reading from or writing to data in blob storage. That's going to cost you money. If you're sending data out of Azure Data Factory entirely, you may have data egress charges as well. So there's a lot of ways that you can spend money when you're doing that. Don't hear me saying that it's more expensive than integration services, because the thing to keep in mind when you're talking about cost is not necessarily what you're spending from 1 month to the next or 1 week to the next. What's the total cost of the solution that you're implementing? So if you think about, for example, integration services, it's not going to cost you anything extra if you run 1 package or 0 packages or 10,000 packages in a month if you're running it on-prem. But you have to look at what you spent to get to that point where it costs you nothing. You had to provision a server, physical or virtual. You had to buy a SQL Server license. You had your time to install, or someone's time, to install the Windows operating system, to install SQL Server itself. There's an investment to get to that point. So even though there are a lot of ways to spend money in Azure, and sometimes it's a bit opaque on how much it's going to cost you before you really get the thing implemented, there are a lot of ways to spend money on SQL Server as well and getting SSIS up and running. It's just a matter of, do you want to spend it all up front, or do you want to pay as you go? Another downside is that there's no free ride for your dev or test environments. In a lot of cases, if you're using SQL Server on-prem, if you have a non-production environment, you can pay less for that license, or in some cases, I think it's none, for that license if it's purely for testing purposes. You don't get the same luxury, unfortunately, in Azure Data Factory. So if you're running anything in ADF, either in the integration services runtime and running your packages natively, or creating a proper Azure Data Factory, you're still going to pay for all the integrations, all the runtimes that you're using, whether they're dev, test, or full-on production. Another downside, this is a minor thing. It's not as mature as integration services. I'm not going to point to a specific thing and say, this is because that product is immature. It's simply, if you've got a product that's been in the market for, on its own, 14, 15 years, but if you include the earlier days from DTS, it's been in the market 20 plus years. It's going to have, just by design, fewer bugs than a product that just came out 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. So while ADF is still maturing, it's growing at a faster rate than integration services ever did. So even though this is a little bit of a downside, the improvements that we're seeing and the new features that we're seeing in Azure Data Factory are outpacing what SSIS ever did, even when you include the 2012 move to the SSIS Catalog. So it's not quite as mature, just in terms of age, but it's getting there very, very quickly. And lastly, for those of you who are using third-party tools for your data flows or your control flows, it's not impossible to use those in Azure Data Factory, but it is more challenging. If you're doing a lift and shift, creating an Azure integration services runtime, you can configure at least some of those tools to run in that integration services runtime. But the instructions to do so, it gets a little complex because you're writing, or at least copying and pasting, PowerShell code to get it in there. It's not as simple as running an executable like you normally would with an on-prem machine. And there are very few options available for you, right now at least, in Azure Data Factory. You don't have the breadth of options that you have in, say, on-prem SSIS for third-party plugins. All right, so that's an overview. Let's talk specifically around some of the head-to-head stuff. We're going to start with functionality. The first thing I want to show you is we're going to talk in a language that's both SSIS and ADF friendly. Most of you know the SSIS projects, the packages, the connection managers, and things like that. I'm not going to go through every one of these, but this is a reference to show you in Azure Data Factory. This is some of the nomenclature that we use to refer to data flow activities and things of that nature. The one that I'll call out is on dataset. I actually reversed those, I just realized that. Dataset should have a star under integration services, and it should be reversed on the other side, where ADF has what we call a dataset. There is no direct equivalent of the dataset in integration services. You might consider a dataset to be the metadata that you get back from a SQL query or a stored procedure, or the metadata around a flat file. So it sort of resembles a connection manager, but not exactly. Every one of those other things do have their parallel from integration services to ADF. This is where it starts to get really comfortable for those of you who have dealt with integration services a lot, because there are, for most everything in ADF, there is a correlation between that ADF piece and some piece in SSIS as well. So when I look at an ETL tool, SSIS or otherwise, I look for how simple is it to do simple data movement. A simple operation needs to be simple. So I don't want to have a lot of complexity simply to move a file from here to there. Allow me to do complex operations with minimal complexity, with only the required amount of complexity, but no more. I want to look for looping logic. So very often you're going to pull out data from a series of flat files, load them in, or the reverse, where you're taking data from a relational data store and writing them into a series of flat files. And I want to see dynamic behavior. Those of you who have sat through my classes before know that I hate hard-coding things like connection strings, file paths, file names, because you're guaranteeing yourself a code change whenever those things change. I want to have some sort of a dynamic behavior, whether it's an expression or a parameter or some other attribute that will let me easily pass in that value at runtime. Other things, I want to be able to have parent and child operations, where I have a thing that calls another thing. So in SSIS, it's a package that calls another package, where we have a parent and child relationship, and we have a controller package that invokes all the other related child packages. I want to be able to call external processes. I want to be able to call a batch file. I want to be able to call an executable. And just as importantly, these probably should have been at the top of the list, Error handling. Your SSIS package or your Azure Data Factory is going to break at some point. You need to have a good plan and know exactly what's going to happen when something breaks, either at the task level or at the row level. So what we have in integration services and ADF for those things, for simple data movement, we have either the bulk insert or the data flow. In ADF, it's called a copy data operation. I refer to this is a loving term, it's not derogatory. I call it a dumb load, where it just takes all the data from here and loads it over here. It doesn't do any sort of update. It doesn't check to see if the data is already there. It's just a simple load operation. More complex things, you're going to see data flow transformations in both of those. Again, data flows in SSIS have been around for a while, very mature. The data flows that you heard about in the keynote earlier today, those have been in preview for a little while, but they've only gone to general availability just in the last few weeks. So you're going to see a few rough edges around that, especially when we talk about performance and functionality. Looping logic, we have for and for each loop in SSIS, and the until and the for each loop in ADF, and then both of them have both expressions and parameters. For parent-child, SSIS will do a package execution where a package executes another package. In ADF, I can execute a pipeline in much the same way that I can do for a package-to-package execution in SSIS. Also, and this is a neat feature of ADF. I don't know that it's going to be wildly popular, but it might be useful for some. All the data flows that you create in ADF are completely decoupled from any pipeline. So if you wanted to create a data flow and reuse it over and over again, it's very easy to do that because those are completely decoupled from the actual, what we would call a package in SSIS, but it's completely decoupled from that pipeline in ADF. Your error handling, just like we saw the precedence constraints in SSIS, we have activity error outputs in ADF. And then on your error handling on the row-by-row level, every one of your sources and destinations in SSIS will let you send bad data out to an error output. It's a little more complicated in ADF because those are actually logged out to your error output in ADF. All right, so let's take a quick look at that. Before we do the demos, any questions that we've got so far? Yes, sir. Great question. So the question was, if you're dealing with on-prem to on-prem data, you're migrating a package up to the integration services runtime, it's reaching back into on-prem, what does that look like? Is it a gateway, is it a VPN, or some other vehicle? The answer is yes, yes, and yes. So if you're already using the enterprise gateway, that's absolutely an option. I think in a scenario like that, the VPN makes a lot of sense because you're creating an entity that's on your, it's not on your physical network, but it's on your virtual network. So that's an option for that as well. I'm sure there are some third-party options that might work as well. We won't get into the details today, but there's actually something called a self-hosted runtime as well, where it doesn't work for the integration runtime, but for some of the assets within Azure Data Factory, you can run your own engine that will do some of those integrations. It wouldn't surprise me if we see something like that extended to the SSIS integration runtime at some point as well for those on-prem workloads. But the bottom line is there are several different ways to do that. The two that you mentioned are probably the most common go-to options, either enterprise gateway or VPN. Yep. David? Good question. If you're going from on-prem to on-prem and you're doing your integration in Azure, there's going to be the cost for the integration runtime, and then I believe you're going to pay data egress because it's going into Azure and coming back out of Azure as well. Yeah. But those are good questions because when we talk about moving something up to the integration runtime, you're running what used to be an on-prem package in the integration services runtime in the cloud. That does work with some caveats if you're dealing with on-prem data sources, but a lot of the scenarios that I see are that you've got an Azure SQL DB in the cloud, another Azure SQL DB somewhere else in the cloud, and you're doing your on-prem integration services. So you're pulling data from here, do your processing on-prem, push it back up to the cloud. That integration runtime works best. If you're already dealing with cloud data sources and destinations, you don't really need to involve your on-prem setup at all, and you just want to push that completely out. Yeah. Yes, sir. Yep, that's a great point. So that's actually on one of the last slides that I show. Custom logic is fairly easy to do in integration services if you're familiar with C# or VB.NET. It's much more complicated in Azure Data Factory. So there is a custom, or there's a custom task that you can implement, but it's not just a matter of writing C# or VB.NET script. It's actually spinning up a cluster in the back end to do that for you, and that requires an additional setup on its own. So the short answer is it can be done. It's not nearly as simple in ADF as it is in Azure, in SQL Server Integration Services. Yes, ma'am.
Does that mean that if you take your SSIS package and put it up there, that you might have to modify your C# code?
So that's a good question. If you're running, the question was, if you take an existing SSIS package, will you have to modify those script tasks or script components? If you're running it in the integration services runtime, chances are good that's going to continue to run, because under the hood, it's actually running on a VM. You're not provisioning a VM, but technically under the hood, it's still spinning up. In fact, it takes a little while when you turn on that integration services runtime. It used to take about a half an hour to spin that up. I don't know that it's still that long. I haven't spun one up in several months. But the reason it took so long is it was creating, behind the scenes, a virtual machine on which that code would run. So if you're not doing anything like accessing local DLLs or custom DLLs or doing something that required local interaction with the file system, if you're going straight from lift and shift and do your on-prem SSIS package and move it up to the cloud and do the integration services runtime, you shouldn't have to do much to migrate those, because you're still running it on a VM. It's just a VM that you don't see. Yeah. Yes, sir.
What's the minimum compatible version of integration services that you need to have in order to bring it up?
The question was, what's the minimal compatible version? I don't know that I've experimented with that. I know it would have to be at least 2012, because you would need to be on project deployment mode. It does deploy it to a virtual SSIS catalog, and that was available starting in 2012. So at least 2012. I don't know that it would support 2012 for certain, but I can tell you that whenever you deploy to the integration services runtime, it does a conversion to, I believe it's still running on 2017. It's not yet on 2019. But that conversion from 2012 to 2017 can be done. So I would expect that you could probably go back to at least 2014, hopefully 2012. Yeah. All right, I'm going to jump in and show you a few demos real quick. Had a few people that mentioned that they haven't seen integration services before. I know a lot of you have. I'm going to take a quick tour on integration services just to make sure that we level set and get everybody at least a little familiar with integration services. So building an SSIS package is done it's a version of Visual Studio called SQL Server Data Tools. In building an SSIS package, everything is arranged just like a development project, where I've got all my code assets over here. Under the hood, these are all just XML files that we're developing, but you don't want to hack that XML. That's a really, really ugly XML, never intended for human consumption. The UI makes this really easy to do. What I do is, let me jump over to the control flow. There's two main tabs that you'll deal with. The control flow, and again, on the ADF side, this parallels to a pipeline. And then the data flow, which, interestingly enough, is also called the data flow in Azure Data Factory. Control flow is where we do most of our non-data movement operations, interact with the file system. If I need to truncate a table in preparation for loading a staging table, that would be done in the control flow. Anything where we connect to a data source, grab some data, or load data to a data destination, that's going to be done in the data flow. Okay, so in this really simple package, I've got an execute SQL statement that's going to truncate the table that we're trying to write to, truncating my demographics raw table. And then on my data flow, I'm loading the data from a local flat file. I've got all that data stored in a CSV flat file. This is configured as a source. It's going to write that data out to a data destination. And the way that it knows, bless you, the way that it knows where that data needs to go is every one of these. So this is a source and this is a destination. Each one of those will have a corresponding connection manager that it uses to connect to that data. In this case, the source is connecting to a connection manager with this name. That's configured with all the metadata for that file. And then similarly on the destination, this one is configured to write to a flat file, or I'm sorry, a table called demographics raw. And again, this points out the connection that we're referring to. All these things will exist both in integration services and in ADF. We have the connection managers, we have the tables that we're writing to, the sources and destinations, and you'll see down in the connection manager tray, these are all the sources and destinations that we're dealing with here. So whenever I want to test this package, I can run it directly in here. I'm not going to run this one. This runs for several minutes. But if I want to test this package directly, I can click on the Start button, and that'll test it just in this IDE, just in this environment. It's not running it on the server necessarily. All the execution, all the hard work is being done right here on my machine. If it interacts with a database, loading data, getting data from a source, getting data from a file, it'll have some interaction with that file system or that database, but the actual integration is done on this machine. Once we push that up to the SSIS server, the catalog server, all the work is being done on the server side. But for right now, it's just on my machine. So this is a really simple SSIS package. Some of the options that we have available to us, I'm going to try to get rid of a little bit of this real estate over here. Some of the options that we have available to us, we can do things like connect to an OLEDB source or destination, use flat files. I can do things like aggregations, get sums, mins, max, and things like that. The gentleman asked earlier about writing scripts directly in here. I've got a script component that will let me embed directly in my data flow, either C# or VB.NET code. It's extremely flexible in that way. It lets me do things like lookup as well. If I'm loading a table that I know already has some data in it and I don't want to reload that data that already exists, I can use the lookup transformation for that. Those are all the fairly basic things of integration services, and for any comparable tool, I want to find if those pieces also exist in whatever tool I'm looking at, specifically in Azure Data Factory. So going back up from the data flow back up to the control flow, there's a few things that I need to look for here. Certainly, I need to look for the data flow operation, where I can move data from X to Y. I look for things like an execute SQL task, where I can execute arbitrary SQL against my database. I look for what do I have in terms of looping logic. If I scroll down just a little bit, I've got sequence containers. I've got a for loop and a for each loop that will let me loop through things like one of the handy features that you'll see in that for each loop container is that I can point to a directory and say I want to process all the text files in that directory one after another. I don't have to write any code to tell it go enumerate those files and bring it into the data flow. So those are some of the nice ways that integration services will let me integrate with data. These have parameters and expressions as well, so if you need to inject some dynamic behaviors in there, it will let you do that. One thing I'll ask real quick, for those of you who are familiar with integration services, who all knows the SSIS expression language well? Keep your hand up if you like SSIS expression language. A lot fewer hands now. So I have bad news for both groups. If you like expression language, when you go to ADF, you have to learn a whole new expression language. If you don't like expression language, you have a new expression language that you're going to have to love to hate, because they didn't port it over. It's a completely different language, totally different syntax. So now you'll have to mentally prepare for having two different expression languages that you're using. I will tell you that in the time that I've used expression language in ADF, it's still a little foreign to me because I've used SSIS expression language so long, and I've learned warts and all. I've learned its shortcomings. But it looks to be a better written language, so I think in the end we'll be happier with the with the ADF expression language, but it is something new that you'll have to learn. Yes, sir?
What other language does it most closely resemble?
Profanity? No, it's... so I would say it looks more like Java or C#. So it's got more functions that you're going to call than what you would normally see in expression language. But it reminds me a little bit of Java or C# or the C-based languages, basically. Yeah. So this is how we'll interact with the SSIS package. If I want to execute those, again, I can pick whichever package I want to execute. When I deploy this, I deploy the entire project up to the SSIS Catalog and then run it from there. So we're going to see some parallels over on the Azure Data Factory side. So I'm going to jump over to my web browser. That's one thing that you're going to notice about Azure Data Factory is that you're no longer developing in Visual Studio. You're developing in your web browser. I'm not a huge fan. I love Microsoft. They make a lot of good tools. I wish they'd stay out of the browser business. I'm not a fan of IE. I would have expected that these things would only run well in IE, but they actually run well in Chrome as well. Firefox, I do like Firefox as my browser, but I found that there are a few quirks in the ADF or in the portal in general when using Firefox. Again, Chrome is not my favorite, but it does seem to work fairly well. It's certainly easier than using Internet Explorer. So if I go back over to my portal. So this is portal.azure.com. So this is where you go for all of your Azure-based assets. If you're creating a VM, creating a network, creating a whatever, this is your starting point. If I'm going to go into my Azure Data Factory, you can see that I've got a data factory created specifically for the PASS Summit 2019. If I were to go into that, I've already clicked on that. That's going to open up a new window that's going to take me to the portal specifically for that data factory. So every time I go into a data factory, it's got its own window that looks like this. This window that shows up lets me it's basically a guide to show me everything that I need to do. I don't need anything on here. If you want to go through some of those videos, they're kind of handy to have little tidbits of information. Where I want to go is over on the left. I want to go to the author window, so click on that. And this will take me, for this Azure Data Factory, this will take me into all the assets that I've already built here. And you can see that I've got several things already built out under my list of pipelines. Remember, these correspond roughly to a package and integration services. I've got a simple copy. I've got a simple data flow copy, several other packages that we're dealing with here. If I scroll down just a little bit, you'll see I mentioned the data sets that we talked about a little bit earlier. A data set, the way those are implemented in Azure Data Factory is that any table, any file, any data store that you connect to will need to have a data set defined for it. So you didn't have to do this in integration services. It's another layer of metadata management. It's not necessarily extra work, but it abstracts that data set definition from the actual loading logic. So if you need to reuse that same file, reuse the same table over and over again, you don't have to redefine that data set over and over again. You define it one time and reuse that throughout your entire data factory. Mickey? That's a good question. The question was, can you run these dynamically where it doesn't know the metadata ahead of time? And there might be 10 columns one time, 16 columns the next time. The short answer is yes, but a qualified yes. So there's a way to tell integration services on the data flow that your metadata might be fluid, that you might have some additional columns. And in a case like that, it's simply going to add those columns to the output. If the metadata is radically different, I haven't tried one where the metadata is completely different, I think you're going to run into some problems. Because if you have that defined where column 1 is a date, column 2 is an integer, and now you've got everything out of order, and now column 1 is varchar data, it's going to have a hard time getting into the database whenever you try to do that insert. So they call it schema drift and not changing schema. There's actually a checkbox that you can say, I want to allow for schema drift. But it's certainly not the full dynamic data flow solution that a lot of us have asked for in integration services. So the data sets are defined there, and if I scroll down just a little bit further, we're going to see the data flows. The data flows, as I mentioned earlier, are defined outside the scope of the actual pipeline, so you can reuse those data flows if need be. And I'm going to go back up to the pipeline here. The first thing I've got here is just a simple copy data operation. This is the simplest thing that you're going to find in Azure Data Factory. If you go to Move and Transform, drag across the copy data, I'm going to click on the copy data, and the only thing it gives me the option to do is define a few things like the name. If I want to define a timeout, I haven't really played with the timeout too much. But really specifically on the source, I define the source, and again, this is one of the data sets that we looked at a little bit earlier. And then the sink. This is terminology. I didn't have that on my cheat sheet a little bit earlier. They refer to data destinations as sink, which sounds like you're flushing something down the sink and getting rid of it. I don't like that term, but that's what they refer to it as, a source and a sink, rather than source and destination. So in this case, I'm pulling data from Northwind order details table. I know I'm old school and using Northwind. Pull that from order details table, and then the sink that I'm using is order details file, again, which was defined as a data set back over here. If I need to do column by column mapping, I can do that here. Just like integration services will do, if those column names are identical and the data types are similar, it will do the automatic mapping for you, and it'll give you a warning if it can't map something over. But you still have the option of using, just like you can on integration services, use your drop-down list and pick a different column name if it doesn't correctly match it up on the auto mapping. And this tells you a little bit about, I hate to quote any sort of pricing because this can change fairly quickly, but it's got some information in line about that. This copy operation, as I mentioned, this is one of the simplest things that you'll do in Azure Data Factory, simply because all it's doing is, looks like I've scrolled away from that, it'll take data from a source, write it into a sink. It doesn't filter it out. It doesn't do anything fancy at all. It's not really a data flow in that there's no pipeline that you're creating. It's simply taking everything from one to the other. The good news is this runs fairly quickly. The bad news is, or the less good news, I guess, is that it doesn't give you a lot of options for transformation. It's really, like I said earlier, it's kind of a dumb operation to take everything from A and load it over into B. When you want to get a little more complicated, you can look into doing something with the data flow. So rather than simply doing the move and transform, rather than doing a copy data, which has very limited options, you can choose to go with the data flow. This is a fairly new technology, and this will let you, much like you can in integration services, create a data flow where you're mapping data from X to Y. So if I jump in there, look at my, drag that down just a little bit, look at my source, my transformation, and my destination. Every one of those has its own source or its own connection defined. So I'm telling it what data set to get that the source data from, where to write it to. The transformation options that I have in here, so I've got a few things that I can add in, like lookups, for example. I can do a lookup. I can do a derived column. In this case, I'm just adding a load timestamp. And all I'm doing is grabbing, so this is using that expression language to grab current timestamp. You get a little more advanced editor on the expression language than you had in older versions, and it'll give you a good language reference if you're learning that for the first time. So this is what a data flow looks like. I'll tell you, we're going to talk about performance in just a minute. I'll tell you that the data flows in Azure Data Factory, those are still evolving in terms of performance. If you're comparing a small file load to a small file load, you're going to find that integration services will outperform it just about every time. I don't think that's permanent. Because what happens, this is not a data flow in the sense of SSIS that it's running on whatever machine that logic is running on. Behind the scenes, that's spinning up a Spark cluster in the background, and it's actually running that on a Spark cluster. So if you have really high-end data flow needs, it's going to perform well because you can spin that out to as many nodes as you need. The downside is for fairly modest data needs, it still has to spin up that architecture. So there is some lag that you have to go through and wait for that to take place before you can run a data integration operation. So a couple of things that I'll point out on here. One of the things that you have the option to add on here, let me get back up to the top. One of the things that you have the option to add on your pipeline is a loop. So the for loop, or the for each loop, or the until loop. One of the things that I found in comparing feature to feature integration services versus ADF is that the for each loop in ADF is not quite as full featured as the one in integration services. If you want to loop through, for example, a series of files, you can do that directly in the for each loop in SSIS. You can't do that in ADF because it doesn't deal with a local file system. You're connecting out to, say, blob storage and pulling it in from a blob store. So you have to enumerate those files separately before you can do any of that operation that you would normally do in one task in integration services. But a lot of the pieces are still in place. So again, if you're using integration services right now, you're moving over to ADF at some point, the sources, the destinations, the data flows, your connections are found in here as well. So if I scroll all the way to the bottom, you'll see connections are down here. All the assets that you'll see in integration services are represented in some way in Azure Data Factory. They'll work a little bit differently. They'll probably perform a little bit differently. But you're going to feel fairly comfortable fairly quickly when you move over there. Yes, sir, in the back. Yeah, that's a great question. So his question was around managing, if you've got a lot of pipelines, if you have, we'll say 50 pipelines in there, they're all going to be just in a list in alphabetical order. Is there a better way to manage those? The downside right now is that there's not a way. I don't believe they've added folderization on there. Let me make sure I'm not telling you wrong. That's one of the things about using Azure Data Factory. I told you wrong. They have added, so you can do a new folder now. So if you wanted to add a new folder, see, every time I do a demo, I find something new. If you wanted to add a new folder, you can do the folder in here, and then I assume do a right-click and move. Not a right-click. Yep, so It's got to move to operation. So absolutely, you could do folders as well. And that's something you don't have in integration services right now. So you can create individual projects, but within that project, you can't create folders inside the project. So this is added behavior in ADF that didn't exist in SSIS. So again, all your connections, your sources, your destinations are in there. You will find once you start working with those that there are some differences, performance differences, functionality differences, but if you're used to working with integration services, a lot of the stuff is going to be familiar. So for simple data movement and complex data movement, I gave both of them high marks on that in my admittedly subjective review. For the looping logic, because it does take a little more effort to do the same things in ADF as it did in integration services, the advantage goes to integration services there. And then your dynamic behaviors, apart from the fact that you need to learn another expression language, there are similar functionalities on each one of those. And then parent-child operations, I mentioned earlier that you can execute packages in SSIS, you can execute pipelines and create a controller pipeline, much like you can create a controller package in ADF. External processes, and then error handling. And error handling at the row level, I mentioned a little bit earlier that it doesn't have quite the same robustness of taking whatever errors exist on either the source or the destination and writing those out to a triage table in ADF as it does in SSIS. That's a critical piece, and I expect that we'll see some evolution on that where it looks a little more like what SSIS has at some point. All right, let's talk performance. So when I look for performance, I want to, first and foremost, I want to be able to tune for performance. So there's a lot of poorly designed ETL processes out there. I want to be able to, I'm a fixer, I'm a consultant. I want to be able to fix them. I want to be able to find what's wrong, diagnose them, and then perform a fix. For minimal resources, if I'm doing small things, I want my ETL solution to perform well on small data sets, even under a minimal configuration with minimal resources. I also want to be able to max it out. If I have a lot of data either on a regular basis or with spikes, I want to be able to scale up or give it enough horsepower to do all that loading. And I want to scale up if necessary, and in some cases, scale back down as well. So the way that we do those things in each tool, data flow memory settings on SSIS, data flow partition sizing on ADF gives me some control over how quickly those things run. On SSIS, this is limited only by how much memory, how much CPU, how much disk you want to throw at it. On the ADF side, this is a limitation because even on the low end, because it's spinning up a cluster to run your data flows, they still have a bit of a lag, like minutes of lag, whenever you're running even a small data flow. Again, I expect those to evolve fairly quickly as the technology evolves, because you're losing a little bit of performance when you move from SSIS to ADF. I don't expect that will always be the case. Both of them have scaling up performance where you're limited only by your system resources on SSIS, throw as much hardware as you want at it, and then scaling up on the ADF side, you can scale up your integration runtime, scale up the system or the Azure resources that you're running that on. So let's talk a little bit about performance, or I'll run through a demo on performance real quick. And what I want to show you on that, some of these things run fairly slowly, so I want to show you the results of what we found here. And I'll show you the actual metrics when we're done here. So what I did on one of these demos, I've got a big file that loads about 1.3 million rows of data. Now, if we were talking about on-prem to on-prem, this is something that's going to run in a matter of seconds, maybe a minute, if we're doing minimal transformations. Anytime we integrate with the cloud, whether we're running this process in the cloud, we're going from on-prem to the cloud, or from cloud to on-prem, we're going to have some other limitations. We're going to have bandwidth. We're going across the internet, so we're subject to whatever the internet gods are up to today. There's going to be some limitations there, and we know that we can't control every aspect of that. What I did find was this was an interesting case on this big package, and I'll have these available for a download afterward if you want to take those and play with them on your own. The one that loads in integration services, just doing a simple copy, whenever I make this a simple copy operation, it truncates the target table and does a load on the target table. The SSIS package running from on-prem up to Azure actually performed worse than Azure Data Factory, even with a minimal configuration on Azure Data Factory. That's not to say that will always be the case, but for that case, because we were going through the internet, going from on-prem to Azure, the Azure to Azure connection was tremendously faster. It was the inverse whenever we were looking at the data flows. If I'm looking at the data flow and I'm doing it from within integration services, the data flow on SSIS proper was outperforming significantly the data flow in ADF. Again, simply because that ADF data flow is designed for bigger data sets and not accounting for that latency that it takes to spin up that runtime every time you're using that. What I will show you real quick is on the execution results. Let me scroll down past some of that. On this particular package, this one ran for the last execution that I ran. This is the kind of information that we'll get from integration services. It'll tell me on an execution by execution basis and even a task by task basis how those things are performing. So I can go through the SSIS logs and pull that information out. If I want to see the same information from ADF, I'll go over to the left-hand side right below the author button. I'm going to go to the monitor button, and this will show me all the executions that I've run through the ADF integration runtime, how long they ran for, what the result was on that, and if there are any error messages, it's going to show me this. Now, you can see that I ran several integrations here. Several of them failed. The last one that I ran did succeed. This is a double-edged sword where you get a little more brief information when you go through this portal to see what's going on. You don't get the same level of detail that you get when you look at the SSIS logs. But when I click on for this one failure, I get just the one error message that was related to that. If you've ever gone through the SSIS error log, you might have to go through 5 or 10 or 20 different messages to find the one that's really at the root. This one will tell you very quickly what the issue is. But for our purposes here, I can look through and see how quickly those things were running, how long they were taking to run. And if I want to go in and see more specific details about that execution for performance, I can click on the button that looks like a sewing wheel or an old sewing bobbin thing. And I can dig in and see for that execution, it ran for 6 minutes and 9 seconds. It failed, and then if I click on data flow details, this takes me into normally it'll give me, let me scroll this down just a little bit and see. There we go. Just a resolution issue. This is going to give me sort of an execution plan to show me where the data went from one step to the next, how many rows were processed, or how many columns were processed, how long each piece took. And this is telling me data flow execution failed due to a configuration error. That was a parameter issue where I passed in an incorrect parameter, and it didn't like that. So again, with ADF, you get all the performance information on a pipeline by pipeline and an activity by activity level. You don't get the same verbosity, but what we do see is for every one of those, we can see how each one performs. Now, performance is one of those things that requires a good deal of testing. So you can't ever say a file is always going to be faster with X instead of Y. But for some really specific tests that I ran, here were the results that I found. Doing a small file, just a few thousand rows, running on SSIS versus ADF with a copy operation, they were within a second of each other, and that was kind of an average of several executions. The same small file running from SSIS, still in a data flow, but using also the ADF data flow as opposed to the copy operation, that went from 8 seconds to 340 seconds. I also put an annotation in there for 180 seconds for the second time around. The reason for that is for that integration runtime that you use on the back end to be able to spin those up, you can tell that data flow runtime, keep this hot for N number of minutes. It's a keep alive setting. By default, as soon as it's done, it kills that data flow integration. It saves you money, but it also means that next time you run it, it's going to have to take the time and spin up all over again. So the second time I ran that, or subsequent runs on that, was averaging about 80 seconds, about half what it took originally. So the upside to that is that it takes less time if you keep that integration runtime hot. The downside is, as long as it's hot, you're still paying for it. So you've still got money going out the door. For those of you who do have integrations that run all day long, if you're running packages all day long and you're moving up to Azure Data Factory, you'll likely have ADFs that are running all day long as well. So it may be that you just keep that thing hot all day long. You keep it warm and ready to go all day long. But do be aware that it does cost you more money if you keep that running all the time, but it also has less latency because there's nothing to spin up on subsequent executions. For a larger file, about 300 megs, about 1.3 million rows, it took 408 seconds on that SSIS package. That's the one that I mentioned just a second ago. On ADF, the same operation took 75 seconds because a couple of different things were going on there. I put an asterisk beside that on the SSIS side. That's going from on-prem to the cloud. So I suspect part of that is just the latency of going through the internet to do that. But on the 75 seconds, with that copy operation, we can see that that's going to be a lot faster than the data flow because it's not doing any sort of transformation whatsoever. So I think the only blanket statement that I can make about performance on that is the data flow right now, under its current configuration, is going to run slower than the copy operation. So if you can get away with just doing a simple copy, by all means do that. If you need the data flow, use it, but be aware that there are some performance limitations on that. Yes, sir, in the back.
But if I understand correctly, you had to move that file into like a file storage or blob storage in order for the data factory to access it?
Correct. Yeah, so the question was, for the file that we're processing, if we're either reading from or writing to, we can no longer refer to that as a local data file. We actually have, well, it's going to be harder to refer to it as a local data file. The easier thing to do if I'm dealing with file-based ETL, either as a source or destination, is to put that in Azure Blob Storage and then pull it out from there. Yes, sir. So again, with just the copy operation, SSIS is significantly slower on that operation. If we flip over to the ADF side, it's actually faster. It's faster on subsequent executions. Again, because once it spins up that cluster, the latency is gone, and it's running faster. It's running about 25% faster on ADF than it is on integration services. So the takeaway from that is for small data sets, you're going to pay a price on that latency if you're dealing with the data flow. For larger data sets, because you can scale out, and by the way, this was on the default setting, the default configuration. It didn't have any extra horsepower added to it whatsoever on that integration runtime. Even on the default settings, that runs faster than my local VM with, I think there's 8 gigs of RAM and 4 virtual processors. It's going to run faster on that side for this file. Your mileage will vary. I can't express enough. For performance, test, test, test. You can't test enough when you're setting expectations for performance. These are some of my findings. Again, just some things to be aware of, especially when you're using that ADF data flow, because it is still evolving. You may see some latency on that when you're running even small data flows through there. So some verdicts on there. Ability to tune for performance. I give SSIS a little bit of an edge here because there are more knobs to turn. Again, it's a plus and minus. It means that I have more control, but it's also more complex in terms of the tuning. Performance with minimal resources, copy operation is fine. The data flows still have a ways to go in terms of low-end performance with minimal configuration. They both have really good top-end performance. I think if anything, I would give ADF an edge here over integration services because if I need to scale up, I can do that really quickly without a hardware change. And then lastly, scale up or down. The clear advantage goes to ADF as opposed to integration services. If I need to spin this thing up and give 10 times or 20 times the horsepower instantly, I can do that in ADF. If I'm doing that in SSIS, best case scenario, I'm shutting down my VM, reallocating resources, and bringing it back up after those changes have been made. All right, the last topic area is manageability. So the essential components that we have here, scheduling, code management, and logging and monitoring. So scheduling and integration services, it's always been fairly simple. SQL Server Agent is the go-to tool. I've seen some other tools out there. I think Control-M is one. There's a number of tools. I've even seen people who are scheduling things using the Windows scheduler for SSIS packages. Please don't do that. It's much easier to do in SQL Server Agent. You've got a lot more options. The bottom line is that you can do all those things in anything that can call a T-SQL function. On ADF, those schedules are called triggers. So we set up a trigger that will trigger on a given day, on a given hour, run every X number of minutes, hours, run on a tumbling window or things like that. Comparable setup to what you have in integration services right now. On code management, any tool that you can plug into Visual Studio will work. Right now, Git is the go-to tool on ADF, so it's full-featured, but you do have fewer options in terms of code management. The logging I talked a little bit about earlier. I've written a lot about integration services logging, so I'm going to admit some bias here. I'm a big fan of the way integration services in the catalog does logging. I hope to see something comparable in ADF at some point, in a proper ADF, not just the integration services runtime. I hope we'll see something like that in ADF at some point. And then monitoring, we all love those Management Studio reports that we see from the SSIS package or the SSIS catalog. You have ADF monitoring in Azure Data Factory. You can also tie into Azure Log Analytics as well. I don't demonstrate that here, but if you want to get a little more information about that and do some analytics on that, Log Analytics is an option as well with ADF. So we'll briefly run through. I'm just going to show you the logging piece of that right now. For integration services, I'm going to jump over to my SSIS catalog. I'm going to go to SSIS DB. Now, those of you who have worked with SSIS, you know that you can go through, right-click, go to Reports, Standard Reports, and All Executions, and you can see every execution that you've run through there. There's nothing wrong with these reports. The downside is, well, I haven't run anything in the last 7 days. The downside to these reports is, there's a couple actually. You can't export this information in a meaningful way. You can print it to a PDF. If you want to, let's say you had an error message in here and you want to get something meaningful out of there. You can't copy and paste in here. I don't know why. You can't select that text. You can't copy and paste from here. What I prefer to do is, and I've written a couple of different blog posts about this over on my blog. If you go directly into the SSIS DB database, there's a very rich set of views that you can pull that same information from. Execution level, package level, project level, even task level and component level are all represented in there. It gives you as much granular information as you want. You can pull that out from the SSIS catalog tables. Yes, sir.
You indicated previously that when you push an SSIS package up, that it'll have the SSIS. It basically is deploying to an SSIS catalog.
Correct.
Is this accessible in any way?
Great question. Question was, if you push this up to the integration services runtime, do you have the same functionality? The answer is yes. So it's still a virtual machine behind the scenes. It's still an SSIS DB behind the scenes. So all that reporting is accessible in exactly the same way if you're using the integration services runtime. Not an Azure Data Factory proper, but just the SSIS packages. Hey, David?
One of the things that I like about SSIS is how you can call the same SSIS package from multiple different places for more application or something, and as such, you can have a lot of different level permissions to access different data points. Is there something comparable like that in ADF?
So if I understand your question correctly, you're talking about permissions on executing the package, or just the way that you can execute them in different ways?
Both.
Okay. So his question was about, on SSIS, you can execute from the SSIS catalog directly. You can go into SQL Server Management Studio and execute from there, SQL Server Agent, or just invoke it directly. And those may all have different permissions depending on the account that you're executing those with. So it's fairly easy to do that with, as far as the execution goes with ADF, because you can simply call, in fact, I should have, invoke AZ Data Factory V2 pipeline. So if you want to execute that via PowerShell, that's something you can easily do via PowerShell. And you can execute that from anything that can call PowerShell. The permission story gets a little more complicated because a lot of times your username, your password, they're embedded in there and you're storing that information securely in there. You can parameterize some of the attributes, but I don't believe the username and password, I'll have to confirm and see, that can be parameterized in the same way that you can do with SSIS packages. So you're a little more limited in SSIS, or you're a little more limited in Azure Data Factory functionality like that than you are on SSIS. If you wanted to call it from what? An Angular application. Ultimately, if you can call something, if you can call .NET code or call PowerShell, you can call it from anything. So this is just PowerShell. PowerShell under the hood is using the .NET framework. So if you can reference the .NET framework, you can call it from any application. Yep. All right, so what I was going to show you on that was a couple of the logging components. We talked a little bit earlier about, let me get back out of here. This resized everything, so all my exit options are gone. There we go. So if I go to monitor, I can see for all my packages, or rather, I keep saying packages, all of my pipelines, here are all the executions that we have for those. I can go into just one specific pipeline and see the executions that we have for those. Again, it's going to show me for the success, it's going to show me that it was successful. Here's the duration. For those that did fail, as I mentioned earlier, you can either just see that error message, or if I want to drill into that execution and see a little more information for that, I go back to the left, pull that information, directly from that one pipeline. So I can see some of the detailed information that we have from there. Again, this is my bias coming through. I still prefer the way that Integration Services does the log management to the way Azure Data Factory does it, but I expect that we'll probably see some evolution there as time goes on, as more people who have been loyal to Integration Services move over to the ADS side. Yes, sir, in the back. Say that again? Can you call an ADF package from Control-M? So I haven't worked that much with Control-M. If it can call PowerShell, the answer is yes. Yep. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that it can, but I'd have to test it just to make sure. That's a good question. So that's some of the logging information. I'm not going to drill through and show you what the source control looks like. So we do have source control capabilities built in here as well. If you're using Git, you can directly plug in the source control there. I'm going to show you a couple of my thoughts on manageability. For scheduling, they're pretty well on par. Code management, I gave SSIS a higher mark simply because you have more options with integration services. Same thing with logging. Again, this is my preference, but I like the more verbose logging, and I pull out what I need as opposed to just getting digested information. And then the monitoring, I think those are on par as well if you compare purely from the SSIS Catalog side of things to the ADF side of things. Those are pretty close in comparison. I'm going to skip through. We've talked mostly about the integration services runtime. You all had some really good questions on that, and I think we addressed all the slide content that we had there. A couple of final thoughts on that. For time to market, ADF really wins here simply because you can spin up an Azure Data Factory runtime in seconds or minutes and have it ready to go. For ease of use, I think if somebody's seeing these for the first time, SSIS gets a little bit higher mark simply because you can edit it offline. It's a much easier code management story. I don't think it's a deal breaker necessarily on ADF side, but it is a little bit easier to get started on integration services. Certainly pricing simplicity is easier with SSIS. Once you make your investment, unless you're running it on a VM, there really aren't any ongoing costs for that. Start small and grow quickly. This is where ADF has the advantage. I can start off with just a few bucks a month, just running what I need, and then grow into whatever I need. SSIS is certainly more mature, but the flip side of that is ADF is growing faster, so it gets all the new and shiny stuff before SSIS does. And then the custom logic, somebody asked a little bit earlier about custom scripting. Certainly SSIS has the advantage here over Azure Data Factory. Yes, sir.
Is there a version 3 that's going to be coming out?
That's a good question. I don't know if there's a version 3. I expect that there will be at some point, but I haven't heard any specific plans about version 3. Yes, ma'am.
Did you set up multiple environments within Azure, within ADF? Did you have an environment, and if so, how do you handle the deployment?
That's a great question. So the question was, if you have dev, UAT, prod environments, how do you manage the promotion between there? The short answer is that would be something that you're going to manage outside of ADF proper. That's something that whatever you're using for deployment, whether it's Azure DevOps or Octopus Deploy or something, ideally that's going to be managed outside of that. We could spend an hour just talking about code management on that. But ultimately, it's going to be something that you're doing outside of ADF proper. Yep. And one more question. Yes, sir.
Data Factory allows third-party plugins or
Good question about third-party plugins. It's certainly easier with integration services. There are some ways to use third-party plugins when you're dealing with the integration services runtime for SSIS packages. And then I think there are some third-party vendors that are getting integrated on ADF, but it's much more difficult when you're talking about something outside of integration services. All right, so let's talk about the verdict. Real quick as we're wrapping up, SSIS works really well for on-prem workloads. If you already own SQL Server, you already know how to do integration services. If you're not expecting a big influx of business where you have to scale up or scale down, and if you're using third-party tools, that's a good case for that. If you're using the integration services runtime, or if you're looking at the integration services runtime, this is where if you have cloud-based sources and destinations, that's a good use case. If you don't have an existing SQL Server, or you don't have one that's ideally suited for also running integration services, if you think you might need to scale up or scale down, and you're not using a lot of third-party components, And then finally, Azure Data Factory. If you're purely dealing with cloud-based sources or maybe a few on-prem sources, you don't have SQL Server that you can use for SSIS, you may need to scale up, and you don't really have any assets in SSIS, there's no real need to have SSIS plus Azure Data Factory. You might as well just go all in on Azure Data Factory. All right, any final questions before we wrap up? Yes, sir.
Can you show us a quick example of a derivation task in Azure Data Flow to see what expression would look like transforming something from?
Can I do it quickly? Probably not. Catch me offline, and I'll show you something that I've got offline. All right, one more question, and then we'll wrap up. Yes, sir.
Azure Data Factory, it's just the data is transferred only between the cloud sources and cloud destinations?
Good question. Is it only transferable between cloud destinations and cloud sources? No. You actually can reach back into on-prem and either get data from on-prem or write data to on-prem, but it does become a little more complicated because you have to have some sort of a gateway or a self-hosted runtime to be able to do that. Okay.
SSIS, it can send from on-prem to...
Absolutely. So the question was SSIS can send up to the cloud. The story going from on-prem to the cloud is much easier than going from cloud back to on-prem because you can reach out to that, set up your firewall where it only lets your traffic through. Reaching back into on-prem, most of our networks are locked down such that they just don't let anything through. So it's a lot more complicated setup if you're doing that. All right. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate it. I do have some cards up here if you want to grab one. Tomorrow, I'm doing a presentation on Azure Functions tomorrow morning. I would love to see you in that if you want to come by. Thanks.